let's get started. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Elahe. I'm part of the team here at iForm Builder Zero on Software. Today we're going to be talking about building smart forms and all the great things you can do with that. Before we get started, if you are on Twitter, feel free to tweet us at #KnowledgeIsGathered. So with that, let's get started. So we have a couple of events coming up, all sorts of webinars and Power User Summit. We'll be sharing this presentation with you afterwards, and you'll be able to click on the links to sign up and learn more about the different webinars and the Power User Summit, which is in May. As always, feel free to ask questions and interact with us. If for some reason you can't hear us clearly, there's also a chat box to ping us there, or questions if you want to start asking questions. I'm going to turn it over to Barrett, and she will be talking all about smart forms.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking your time out of your schedule to join us today. I'm really excited to go through the smart forms and how to add smart controls to your forms. If you've attended this session before, you'll notice some new updates, as well as a sneak peek at some server, or I guess some device updates that will be coming shortly. So in one part of the form, I've implemented what that will look like to have that functionality in my form, but sadly with our iForm app, it hasn't been updated yet, so you won't be able to see the results, but it's still pretty neat. Like Elahe said, if you have any questions while we're going through it, feel free to post those in the question box, and at that point, either Elahe will answer them or she'll pass them on to me. So our training topics for today, we're just going to do a quick overview of the smart controls. I'm not sure what level everyone is at here and if they're familiar with using the smart controls, but we're going to start with the basics today and then go a little bit further as we continue. After we do our overview, we're just going to do some simple functions in a form. Then I'll show you how to display the user's input or their selection. From there, we'll go through adding functionality to option lists and our iForm Builder built-in functions, and lastly, the third-party app and URL scheme. All right, before we go too far into our smart forms, we need to always make sure that we cover the best practices for form building. The first thing is to sign up for our Customer Success Center. If you haven't done that yet, or if you've just gone in there and looked at some of the knowledge base articles, that's great. But if you sign up for an account within our Customer Success Center, then you can join the forums and join the conversations, as well as if you decide to follow a specific article, every time that it's updated, it'll send you an email. So what a lot of folks will do is they'll follow our release notes, and so every time we have a new release coming up, they'll get an email telling them that a new release has been scheduled. So that's actually our third step here. But before that, we also have that community forum, and I highly suggest that you partake in our Vote for Features section. This is where we get a lot of our upcoming releases and ideas for ways to improve the platform. It's from you. So if you find something there that you really you agree with and you want that update to occur, tell everybody that you know to go into the community forum and place an upvote for that specific idea. That way, the further up it gets on our list, the more apt and faster we'll be that we'll be able to implement that with the platform. Next, we have our chat with an agent in the chat box. So if you're familiar with the platform, you've probably noticed that little chat box at the bottom. We usually have at least one agent in the iForm Builder chat to be able to answer any of your questions that you have while you're building your forms. We have a team here in the US as well as in Hong Kong, so we try to keep you covered as much of the day as we can. From there, we have our implementation support. This can be used for form building. This can be used to talk about your workflow, whatever it is that you need, and how we can help you to implement that need. That's what our implementation support team is for. Then we have our iForm Builder training sessions. Those are here, these free training sessions that we have for you, as well as we can go on site and do online training sessions too to customize what the need is for your specific company. And the last thing here is we highly suggest to include multiple members of your team to learn the platform, just because the more members who understand it, the more that you can use it. And you never know what passions you find within your users or within your other colleagues. Maybe they're just learning JavaScript and they get really excited about iForm Builder and building forms, and you wouldn't have known that unless you gave them the chance. Moving forward, we have our form building, our best practices. So the first one here is to use a naming convention for all forms. This is done within the table name. This helps you keep your forms organized, as well as if you have anyone else on your team building forms, they're able to identify what forms are connected. So what's a parent form versus a child subform. Here's just an example of my account, and you can see that I started the first time using just _parent, but I've actually updated that to be _p if it is the parent form, and _c if it's a child form. That way, just it keeps all my forms together, and like I said, it helps me stay a little bit more organized. The next best practice that we have here is to clean your local database in the iForm app if something doesn't look right. This can be found in the same box where you log into the iForm app. They'll say clean local database, and that allows you it basically wipes out everything in the iForm app, and then the next time you sync, it just brings everything back in. The reason, not only because something may not look right, but also because sometimes the JavaScript, if you get really advanced in your forms, it can be cached and it could carry over some of that functionality. So if something's not looking right, just make sure you clean that local database. Next, we have to test on all device types before going live. The reason that we suggest that you do this is, test on the smallest device versus the largest device to make sure your form is looking the way that you want it to, but also test on if your users are going to use both an Android device and an iOS device. Make sure that the form, again, is doing exactly what you want it to do on both platforms. Next, it's to open multiple browser tabs for convenience. I do this a lot when I'm building out my forms, and if I'm using either subform aggregation, or I need to, if I'm carrying over a number from different, maybe from my child subform, I want that result showing in my parent form, I'll need to get that table name, and that's why I'll have a tab open for each part of that form process. The next best practice here is actually more of a preference on my end. If I do have a form that I essentially at the end I want to have it as some of these fields required, I usually add that as the very last step, so that while I'm building out my form, I can go and submit the data for specific fields to make sure it's looking right without having to fill out the whole entire form every single time I want to test something. Then we have that this is more of a reminder that every form that you create is automatically going to be assigned to you. So if you don't want to have the subforms viewable on your device, you'll have to go under form assignment and unassign those subforms. The same thing goes that if you are assigning the parent form, or if you are assigning all the forms to your users, you only need to assign them that parent form, and all the other forms will come with it. And then the last one here is to follow the iForm Builder golden rules. Now, if you're unaware of those iForm Builder golden rules, I will be covering those in just a minute, but they're so important that I hope you've already seen them. So here we have just another best practice, and this is to use the reference IDs. These are used to help your users identify the forms on their device by setting a color around them. You can see here on this screenshot, I have black around this one form and red around this one. That's customized within the reference IDs. But you can also customize what fields are shown in the info button. So that little info button you have, it'll always default to show you specific fields like version, modified date, modified by, and those fields are always default. So if you want to maybe only show one or two of those, then that's another way that you'd use your reference IDs. This is a link that once I share this PDF with you, you'll be able to click on that, and that will bring you to our help desk article on how to use those reference IDs. And here are our form building golden rules. So the first one, always test before going live. This is so important. You never want a form to be broken when you're out in the field. So make sure that you and maybe some of your colleagues test the functionality of that form before you are maybe in a remote location where you can't make any changes to that form. Again, test, test, test. It's just so important. Then we have the unique data column names that are database friendly. So every time you create a new input in a form, you have the label and you have the data column name. The label can be whatever you want it to be, but the data column name is what needs to be unique. We do have a list of reserved words that can't be used, and that's also a link here into our help desk. If a data column name is not database friendly, then you'll uncheck the box that says based on label, and you can change that data column name to whatever you so choose. Then the last piece here is a really important one as well, which is do not change the input type, the data size, or encryption of an element on a live form because it will delete the data. So if you are thinking that you were previously using a select option list and you have had maybe 50 different records come in using that select option list, and now you want to change that option list to a pick list, the way that's done is by first disabling that first select option list, disabling that element so that it's no longer being used, and then you'll add a new element, or you can copy that previous select option list and then make that into a pick list after the fact. And then you can have all the same settings, but it'll be a different input type. You just won't lose your data that way. So that's how you'd make a change, just by disabling the first element. All right, Elhe, are there any questions coming in?
Not so far, but I'll let you know if any do come in.
All right, thank you very much. All right, so here's our overview of smart controls. What are they? Smart controls are how you add that functionality to a form. So instead of having your form being very static, you can use the smart controls so that you can automate this process and make your form a little bit more user-friendly. Smart controls, they use basic JavaScript statements and they add actions to the different elements. Reasons to use smart controls: to cut down on human interaction with a form, to define what a user sees based off their selections, and to cut down on human error. Now that last one, to cut down on human error, that's a big one for a lot of people in that data integrity. So this is another great reason and why we try to push people to use our smart controls, and why we as users ourselves always try to test out the JavaScript statements and try new things with our smart controls. If you're brand new and you want to have a little bit more practice, or if you want to see a little bit more of JavaScript, w3schools.com/js is a great website. I personally like to go check that out and see what some other JavaScript statements are. And then below that is another link. I'm not as familiar with this one, so I usually try to suggest to go to the W3 Schools. Now, in your smart controls, once you go in there, and if you have your form builder open right now, and I'll actually open one of my forms to show you where that is. So in every form builder, you have your smart controls. So here's the list of the dynamic value, condition value, dynamic label, as well as client validation and validation message. In a nutshell, these are what each one does. Oops, got a little box there. Sorry about that. So that dynamic value, you use the statements to set a value of an element. The conditional value, I usually think of that as when you want an element to be viewed or not to be viewed. And the dynamic label, It's a way to use a JavaScript statement to specify the label of an element. And then the last two actually go together, and it's the client validation and the validation message. And what these do is that you add a logic in there to restrict a record from uploading on the device until certain values are entered or a certain criteria is being met. If that criteria is not met, then whatever the validation message is that you place in here in quotes will be shown to the user. So just a little bit more, so you can show and hide the elements based on the user's input. You can default elements, you can do mathematical calculations, as well as concatenate multiple elements into one element. You can do your client validation, subform aggregation, and integrate with third-party apps and URL schemes. So now I'm going to bring up my device to show you a quick demo. All right, so sorry about the delay there. I was just trying to get my device up to show you on the screen. Okay, so I'm just going to go into my iForm app. And at the bottom, I have the most current form that I created, so my Smart Controls demo form for February 2015. And if I go back, I wanted to just show you what I was talking about earlier with the reference IDs and how you can customize. If I press this little info button, this gives me a description of this specific form. As you can see, I didn't actually create one, but then you have the version, and these are the defaulted fields that will always show unless you go through your reference ID 5 and update it to specify which one of these fields are being shown to the user. But now we're just going to open our form. And the first part of this form is using concatenation. So here I'm going to just place in my first name, but I'm just, of course, my first name and last name is a little bit long, so I'm going to keep it short. And this one, I've actually used the Social Security number widget to use a mask for birth date. And now you can see that at this bottom field, I've concatenated, oops, I didn't place anything there. I've concatenated both the first name, the last name, and the birth date into one field that can be viewable to the user, but they can't make any changes. The reason you might want to use some concatenation besides just to have those different fields is maybe for your data side, maybe your reporting side, you want to compile all that information into one field, but you may not want to viewable to the user here. So I could update that and hide this element from the user if I so choose. Next, we have our client validation. So this is how I've directed my user to choose a date in the future. And if I say I select today, I get this little error message, and it just went away rather quickly, but it said that I had to enter a date in the future. So now if I go ahead in and I select a date in the future, I don't get that error message. So that's that client validation. From there, this next section is with our option list. So show an element based on a user's input. This is just a yes or no question. I've added some images, as you can see. From there, if I choose yes, then it'll ask, what equipment was broken, as well as if it needs to be replaced and repaired. And I've defaulted the email widget to show an email address. And that's another way to use our smart controls, is to default elements. Then we have our smart option list. And this is a segmented option list, or you can call it either one. Basically, the way that it works is you might have a bigger category, and then you'll break it down even further. So here our categories start with what is the focus of the exercise today. And if I select a list, my next pick list underneath will show either arms, legs, or other. If I go back and select the speed and agility, it'll change that list to show jump, skip, and hand coordination. So that's how the segmented option list works. It just starts with a big picture and then breaks it down further and further. Now I'll just select skip here. And what it did underneath that is we used two of our newest functions well, one of the newest functions. We've always had this ZZ display value. So it displays the result to the user of what they selected, as well as our ZZ display key. Now that's forcing the key value to be shown here. Then we have some more iForm Builder built-in functions. The first one is using a basic script in the dynamic value, and it'll force the username to be displayed here in a read-only field. Now underneath that, you'll see three other elements, which is display first name, display last name, and display email. Those three fields are going to be, that's I guess your little sneak peek, because that's going to be in our next release. So that will force the user's first name to be shown, their last name, as well as their email address. And then we have our aggregation. So what this does, and I go into my mathematical field. Of course, you could use this for calculations of, elements or inventory, whatever it is that you want to maybe get a sum of in the parent form or get the average of in the parent form. You can use the subform aggregation. So here I'm just going to place in some numbers. And it takes the totals there, and now that's one record. I won't be able to aggregate much data with one record, so then I need to create another one. And I'll just press done. And if I go back, then you'll notice these two fields underneath, the subform aggregation addition and subform aggregation average, have been totaled. So that's using some of our built-in functions. And then we have our third-party app. So for this one, I specifically set it as an SMS. And so by launching this application, it opens up my text messaging system and it places a specific number in there. So that was my supervisor's number, and that means I don't need to have that specific number in my form, or on my device, I should say. I'm sorry. And then I can also launch maps. So this will open up my Google map, and I've set it to a specific coordinate, and from there it's going straight to that location. And if I needed to get directions or something, I could do that as well. And this is the functionality with our third-party app. And then the last thing here is that it says, thanks for taking the time to fill out this form today, B. Now it got the letter B because at the top of my form, I placed in first name B here, and I used the dynamic label to place in that information at the bottom. All right, so hopefully that was a little bit helpful to show you some of the things that you can do with the smart controls. And now I'm going to actually show you how to do some of that.
Hey, Barrett.
Sure.
We have some questions coming in if you're ready for them.
Sure.
So the first one is, are disabled elements shown on the downloaded spreadsheet?
No, they are not. They're completely, it's basically like they've been removed except for the data that was collected for them.
Cool, thanks. Good to know. Can you add options to an option list or pick list without deleting the data?
The best practice to do is, if you do need to add any additional options, is to add them at the very end. If you add them at the beginning, it makes it a little bit, it may mess up with the key values. The key values are what always needs to be the same. So if you do need to make changes to an option list, and let me just open one to show you this. I'm going to open up my option list manager, and I'm going to go under the advanced section. If I needed to make any changes, then I need to make sure that these key values, or this key value and the index value, are the same for that option. So if I need to add a new one, then I wanted to add it below. And that's how I would make sure that I wouldn't mess up any of the data in my option list manager.
Okay, cool. And then I think there's one, yep. So icons appear on what type element?
Icons can appear on, you can use icons multiple ways. So you can use them in your option list like I did here, but you can also use an image label in your form. and that can be done as just an input property. But for every element that you use, if you've synced your Dropbox or Box account to, and you've called a picture, whatever that data column name is, then you can also have that with your text fields and everything else in there too.
Cool, thanks. That's it for now.
Sure, thank you. All right, so before I show you how I built out that form, then we just have some other overview of the smart controls. The first thing is that you need to use the data column name. If you have more advanced JavaScript statements, then you'll want to place them in the page level JavaScript. That way it can fit better there, as well as if you maybe are using that statement in multiple elements in your form, then you'll also want to place that in the page level JavaScript. And then this is just a quick little tip on what in basic JavaScript, what each this means. So if you're trying to have two functions or two things happen and you need to say and, like maybe you say in one of your option lists, show this element if this is the option that the user selects, and if they select this one, or if they select either or for that. And then you have the equals sign together, just means that it's equal to something else. And lastly, placing false in the condition value will hide that from the view on the device. And then if you need to default elements, these are just some of the basic ways to do that, but here specifically on some elements that you can default. So in the form that I had, I defaulted my email address, and so I placed my email address in the dynamic value around what I call the squiggly brackets and in quotes. This is also how I customized my mask. I used for the user to enter their birth date in the very top. Sorry, in the input type, I select Social Security, and then I made the mask fit my need. These are the other customization options that you have. So if you only want to allow for numerical input, or if you only want to allow for alpha characters, you have that option, but you also can give the option to allow for either or, either a numerical or alpha character. And the last one is an optional. So maybe sometimes you want to set the mask so that it can be up to 8 different fields, but sometimes a user may only have 6. So you'd use 2 of those for the optional pieces there. Then we have our basic math functions. This is on the same page because with your math functionality and with concatenation, you're following the same kind of structure with your JavaScript statements. You're using these squirrely brackets, and then you're using the data column names that you have for the other elements. So if I were to add an additional field like I had in my form, then I would use the first 3 data column names and then place this quote or this statement in the dynamic value for my totals element. And you can see this also in the form sample that I had was this is our read-only field for concatenating the first and last name as well as the date and birth. So if I go into my smart controls, I have this data column name, so first _2 and last _1 plus the date of birth. So these are I also placed in the dynamic value this statement for each one of these elements. This is just basically telling the element this is your name, and so I'm going to call to it later on. This isn't always a requirement using the equals and then 2 quote signs, but I find that if for some reason my functionality isn't working, that by placing that in the dynamic value, I do get, it does work much better. Then we have our dynamic label. So for the example today, I used the dynamic label at the very bottom, and that's where I wanted the user's name to be. So in the dynamic label, I placed in quotes, "Thanks for taking the time to fill out this form today," and then I used the data column name for that first field of the form. With our client validation, so this is where we made sure that the user had to select a date in the future. And so I had to have 2 fields. Now this first field was hidden, and I defaulted this field to make sure that it was defaulted to today's date. The reason that I wanted this hidden is because the user didn't need to see that. They only needed to see the field that they had to select a date in the future. So then if I go down to this field and I look at my client validation, I have the data column name, and then I've set it so that it has to be greater than today's date, which is this element right above. From there, in quotes, I just placed in the message that I wanted the user to see if they didn't meet that criteria. Then we have adding smart controls to our option lists. There may be a time, like in my example, that you have the other field in your option list. So when that's the case, you may not want to show that field to the user until they've selected either other, or in this sample, I ask if there's any broken equipment, and if they said yes, then I would ask the question what was broken, and if they said no, then they wouldn't need to fill that out. So what I've done is for this field underneath, I said broken equipment, and this is the data column name for this select option list, and I placed equals equals because if this is shown here, then I need it to, if it shows this specific option, that's when you show this field. So I have it equals equals 0 because 0 is the first option in that select option list. So 0 is equal to what yes was. I then set these other elements to the same thing, and I've used my dynamic label again and said does blank what was broken, so that text field, that whatever they placed in there, maybe they placed that a window was broken, it would say does window need to be replaced or repaired, and then their options was yes or no. From there, I've set up my email address. I've defaulted it to my own, and I've again I only want that element shown if they selected yes from that option list. Now we have our smart or segmented option lists, and this is where I have 2 different option lists. I have the first one, which said what is the focus of the exercise today, so that's where I had either it was either if it was lift or speed and agility, and the data column name that's found here, which is type of exercise. I use that in my ZZ display value, and I have it set so that it'll just show that selection there, and that's also a hidden field. But if I go to this next pick list, so if I selected speed, remember it would show specific tasks and speed. So if I go to that option list, in my option list manager, this is where and how I segmented that option list. I went to the advanced, and I said if they chose lift, then show arms, legs, and other. If they chose speed and agility, then show these options below. So as you can see here too in the advanced, every option list always starts with 0 in the index value. That's why you set it up here to start as 0 as well. Okay, before we go any further, Elahe, are there any questions?
There are. We have 2 of them. So on the email default value, can you pull that from another element so the email can be used as a variable?
Can you pull it from another element? I mean, yes, you can, especially now with our specific our new built-in function, which is the iFormBuilder.email. That's one way that you could bring it in, especially if it's the user who's logged into the device. But another way that you can bring in that email address is through an option list. So maybe you have 5 different emails or supervisors that they may need to email. So that's where you'll be able to have them select that email address from there and then default it into the email widget.
Okay, cool, thanks. And then the other one is, are 9s required for the view, or will any number work in the SSN mode?
Okay, great question. So for the masking, I'm just going to go back up here. These, if you're going to use 9, that's for just the optional numerical value. So in the zip code mask, it always has these 9. So maybe if you're in a different country or in Canada and you have more than here in the US, how many zip codes we have, then that's why we have those as the optional numerical values.
And then there's one
Go
more.
ahead. Sure.
Can you use the same concept of dynamic value without an option list? Like if you have a table of values with columns for types and details.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. Can you use the same concept of dynamic values without an option list?
Oh, you can. Yes, you can. You can set it so that maybe if it's a text field, you want to set it so that another additional field won't be shown unless they start typing something. You can default that element to only show once they've started to input text. And actually what I have up here is the way to do that. So I would use text, the data column name. So here is just a text element dot length. And then I've set it up so that it has to be greater than 0 for that dynamic value.
That's it for now.
All right, and those are the answers that I just explained. If there are any other follow-up questions, please be sure to ask Elahe, and I'd be happy to give more details if needed. All right, so next we have our ZZ display value as well as the ZZ display key. That's a mouthful. The ZZ display key is a newer function that we implemented, and this is for some folks that wanted to make sure that we forced the key to be shown. By default, if you were going to call to an option list and have the user's selection be shown, by default, it would always show that index value. So that index value is what started with 0 and went on from there. So most likely you don't want that to be shown, and you might want to add more functionality. And that's when you're going to need to use either the ZZ display value or ZZ display key. In this example, you can see that I've named my option list, or I've named that data column name underscore option list element data column name. So if you were to implement this, what you'll see is that in the smart controls, it would be underscore and whatever the data column name is. So here it was what type. And the same thing goes for that ZZ display value and what type, and that's referring back up to the what type pick list that I have here. All right, so then we have our built-in functions. So the first ones up here are the user information. The iFormBuilder.username can be used right now, but the other 3 are the up-and-coming features that we have, and those are coming out in the next release, which will hopefully be soon for the iOS side. If you're using Android devices, you should actually already have this functionality. So this is just iFormBuilder.firstname, iFormBuilder.lastname, and iFormBuilder.email. And that's just calling to the information that the user has placed in their profile. So if you're the one setting up the new users, then make sure that you include their first name, last name, and email if you plan on using this functionality. Then we have that subform aggregation. This is currently it's just iformbuilder.math.sum and iformbuilder.math.average. To show more of what that looks like, I'm going to bring up my screen over here, but also I'll show you, I have written up the steps that you need to take place as well. So here is that subform that I'm aggregating the totals from, and the common, or my data column name, is subform to aggregate totals. Now in the smart controls, you'll see iformbuilder.math.sum, and that's what you start with here. And then you'll see the table name for this particular form. So this is this form's table name, which is located in my Edit Form Properties page. So this is my table name. And then I have dot subform to aggregate totals. This is the subform above here. And from there, I have, after that is the element within that subform that I'm calling to that total from. So that's that total field that I created. Same thing goes for the average. It's just instead of iformbuilder.math.sum, it's iformbuilder.math.average. Then another built-in function is our getNextSequence, which allows the user to keep track of how many records they have provided. This is a great tool if your user's never going to clean their local database, but every time you wipe out the local database or clean the local database, then it would start at 0 again. So just keep that in mind too. And here are those steps that I just went through for the subform aggregation. And just to reiterate with the upcoming functionality here for the user information, just iformbuilder.firstname, and then the same thing goes for a last name and email. All right, now we have our third-party app widget. This is a way that I was able to launch the SMS to text my supervisor and default it to a specific number or phone number, as well as a specific location within the map. This is done pretty easily, and it's just by first going in the input properties, and you select the third-party input type. And what I've done here is I've set it up to a specific phone number. So that's the supervisor that I'll need to call. And then for the launch maps, this is the URL for the URL scheme that you'll use. And from there, for the name and values, I put the exact coordinates of the location that I want it pointed to in my maps. Now, if you're curious about starting to implement this, like you can see here, it's only a couple steps that you need to take, but we do have a very helpful article, and I strongly advise everyone to go check it out if you want to implement it. And that is, so this is a link to it, and you'll just be able to click on that and from the PDF, and I am going to just bring that up for you. At the bottom of this page, what you'll notice, once it loads, of course, is that at the very bottom there are 2 links that you'll be able to click on, and those will give you more options as far as the third party and how to set that up. All right, Ella, it looks like my screen's slowing down or freezing. So do you have any questions coming in while that's going on?
None right now, no.
Okay. All right, so too many windows keep popping up. Sorry about that, folks. But here are just some of the examples that you can do. You can also design your own third-party app, and one of my colleagues has successfully done that. He's done a counter widget or a counter app so that to help users just go 1, 2, 3, 4 and up and down. And based off of that, he can pull in from this third-party app, he can pull in the information from the counter app into the iForm Builder data, and that's done using the URL scheme. We have some steps on how to do that if you're planning on building your own either on iOS or Android. But we also, if you're using Esri, you can add the URL scheme to connect the collector Esri app and the iForm Builder app so that data can flow back and forth through the apps themselves. All right, to add even more to your form, these are just some links that I think will be helpful to you, but of course, make sure you check out our Customer Success Center. And lastly, we do have in our iForm Builder Academy, we have a list of all our training webinar sessions that we've already recorded, but also our upcoming sessions. And we do have implementation support, training courses, and our Kickstart training program. Are there any other questions? I know this was a lot to take in, especially if you're brand new using smart controls, but hopefully you feel a little bit more comfortable putting smart controls in your form, as well as now you have a resource with a lot of links that you'll be able to reference when you start doing that.
So Barrett, just to go back a minute or two, if both Android users and iOS users are using the third party, do you populate both fields in the input properties?
Yes, you do. That's a great question. I knew I was only going to use the iOS, so that's why I set it up here. But you can easily put it in so that's both iOS and Android.
Thanks.
And here, finally, this page loaded. So at the bottom here, these are the two links. You can use the URL schemes from here or the iPhone URL schemes. This page will bring us up to a list of the different URLs that you can have here. So your maps, your phone SMS, but also some other third-party apps that you may want to call to within your specific form. And then if I go back and I click on this other one, then I'll be able to do some searching and get both the iOS as well as the Android URLs for this. And if you can't find what you're looking for and it's not working, then just let us know and we can try to point you in the right direction. Are there any other questions?
There are not right now.
Well, thank you everyone for attending. Elahe and I will be on the call for the next 10 minutes. So if you do have any other questions coming in or if you want to place your questions in now, we will be here and we'll be happy to help.
Thanks, everyone.